My name is Sam Carter. I'm 56 years old now, but I was 52 when it happened. For 30 of those years, I worked for the United States Forest Service, most of that time spent in the rugged, unforgiving backcountry of the Cascade Mountains in Washington. I've tracked cougars, tranquilized problem bears, and spent more nights under the stars than I have in a proper bed. I know the sounds of the forest. I know its rhythms, its dangers, and its deceits. I thought I knew every secret the mountains held. I was wrong. I'm telling this story because the official report is a lie, a neat and tidy piece of fiction designed to close a file and let people sleep at night. But I was there. I know what really happened to Mark, and I know what's still out there, waiting in the deep woods. The trip was supposed to be a final send-off for the season. My oldest friend, Jake Miller, owned a small, rustic cabin deep in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest, miles from the nearest paved road. Jake and I came up together in the service, him with fish and wildlife, me with the Forest Service. We were two sides of the same coin. He called me in early October. The plan was to head up to his cabin for a long weekend, do some minor repairs, drain the pipes, and board the windows up before the first heavy snows made the access road impassable. It was a yearly ritual, one last taste of true wilderness before winter closed its fist around the high country. This year was different. Jake's nephew Mark was coming along. Mark was 28, a software developer from Seattle who viewed the outdoors as a scenic backdrop for his Instagram posts. He was bringing his girlfriend, Sarah, a girl so thoroughly urban she probably thought flannel was high fashion. Jake had been trying to get Mark more interested in the family's outdoor heritage, and he saw this trip as a gentle introduction. I had my reservations. The cabin wasn't a glamping spot. It was off-grid. No cell service, no electricity, just a wood stove, a well pump, and propane lanterns. It was a place that demanded respect and a certain level of self-sufficiency. Mark and Sarah, from what Jake told me, possessed neither. We met at a ranger station at the edge of the forest boundary and convoyed in. Jake and I were in his old Ford F-250, a beast of a truck that had seen more dirt than pavement. Mark followed in his gleaming new Subaru, the roof rack empty and the paint job spotless. It looked comically out of place on the gravel road that quickly deteriorated into a rutted dirt track. The drive itself was a slow, grinding affair. The forest closed in around us, a dense wall of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The air grew cooler, sharper, smelling of damp earth and pine. It was a smell that always felt like coming home to me. The cabin sat in a small clearing, nestled against a steep, timbered ridge. It was a simple, sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mortar that had been patched and repatched over 60 years. A stone chimney rose from the steeply pitched metal roof, and a wide porch ran the length of the front. It was a place of profound silence. When we killed the engines, the quiet was so complete, it felt like a physical pressure on my eardrums. There were no distant cars, no planes overhead, just the sigh of the wind through the high branches and the chatter of a Steller's jay protesting our arrival. We spent the first afternoon settling in. Jake and I showed Mark and Sarah the basics, how to work the hand pump for water, how to light the propane lanterns without losing your eyebrows, and the cardinal rule of the wood stove: keep it fed, but don't choke it. Mark tried to be helpful, but he moved with the awkwardness of someone who was constantly afraid of getting a splinter. Sarah mostly stayed on the porch, wrapped in a designer parka, taking pictures of the rustic aesthetic with her phone, forgetting she had no signal to post them. Jake and I exchanged a look. It was going to be a long weekend. That evening, after a dinner of chili and cornbread, we sat around the big pine table, the cabin warmed by the crackling stove and lit by the soft hiss of the lanterns. The light cast deep, dancing shadows in the corners of the room. Outside, the world had disappeared into a bottomless, moonless dark. This was the part of the wilderness I loved most, the feeling of being in a small, warm bubble of light and life, with a vast, indifferent darkness pressing in on all sides. It was a humbling feeling. Mark, however, seemed to find it unnerving. He started telling bad campfire stories, tales of Bigfoot and ghostly lumberjacks he'd probably read on the internet. He was trying to be funny, to lighten the mood, but his jokes fell flat in the heavy silence. "You guys ever see anything weird out here?" he asked, looking from me to Jake. "You know, like a Sasquatch or something." Jake just shook his head, a small, tired smile on his face. "The weirdest thing I've ever seen out here is a city kid who doesn't know how to stack firewood," he said, and we all laughed, even Mark. I told him the truth. In 30 years, I'd seen things that were unusual, bears that acted strangely, weather that came out of nowhere, but nothing that I couldn't eventually explain through natural causes. The woods were full of strange noises and fleeting shadows, and an overactive imagination was more dangerous than any animal. I told him the most important thing was to stay rational, to observe, and to not let fear run away with you. I had no idea how profoundly those words would be tested. Later that night, I was woken from a shallow sleep by a sound. It wasn't the usual night noise of the forest. It wasn't the scuttling of a mouse in the walls or the distant hoot of an owl. This was something else. It was a heavy, rhythmic thump. It was slow, deliberate. It sounded like something immense was walking, the impacts carrying through the ground and up into the floorboards of the cabin. I lay there in my bunk, holding my breath, listening. Thump, thump, thump. It moved past the cabin, somewhere out in the clearing, and then faded into the trees on the other side. My heart was pounding. My first thought was a bull elk, or maybe a moose, but the footfalls were too heavy, too slow. It sounded like it was walking on 2 legs. I told myself I was half asleep, that it was just a dream or the cabin settling. I tried to go back to sleep, but I spent the rest of the night staring into the darkness, listening. The next morning, I brought it up with Jake as we were drinking coffee on the porch. The air was cold and crisp, and a low-lying fog clung to the floor of the clearing. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked him, keeping my voice low so Mark and Sarah wouldn't overhear. Jake looked at me over the rim of his tin mug, his eyes serious. "Heard it," he said simply. "Woke me up around 2. Sounded big." "Too big for a bear," I said. It wasn't a question. "And the gate was wrong," he added, confirming my own thoughts. Bears shamble. This was a steady 1, 2, like a person, a very, very heavy person. We decided to take a walk around the clearing, leaving Mark and Sarah with the simple task of splitting some kindling. The ground was damp from the morning dew, perfect for holding tracks. We circled the cabin, our eyes scanning the ground. On the far side of the clearing, near the edge of the timberline where I'd heard the sound fade, we found them. There were 3 distinct prints, pressed deep into the soft earth. My blood ran cold. They were huge, at least 18 inches long. They were shaped vaguely like a human foot, but broader at the ball and with a more pronounced arch. But the terrifying part was the toes. There were 5 of them, just like a human, but they were tipped with deep impressions of massive, non-retractable claws. They weren't bear tracks. A bear's rear print is long and vaguely humanoid, but the claw marks are different, and the overall shape is unmistakable to a trained eye. These were not bear tracks. The stride between the prints was immense, easily 8 feet. Whatever made these was bipedal, massive, and had walked casually across the clearing while we slept. Jake knelt, tracing the outline of one print with his finger. "Never seen anything like it," he murmured, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and concern. "The weight to make an impression this deep, we're talking 900 pounds, minimum." We tried to rationalize it. We went through the entire catalog of North American fauna. A deformed bear? A grizzly that had wandered way south of its usual range? None of it fit. The bipedal gait was the part we couldn't get past. We considered the possibility of a hoax, but that made even less sense. Who would come all the way out here, to this specific, isolated cabin, to press fake monster tracks into the ground in the middle of the night? For what purpose? We made a decision not to tell Mark and Sarah. There was no sense in frightening them. We'd stay alert, keep a rifle handy, and dismiss it as a strange but ultimately explainable event. We were practical men, Jake and I. We believed in evidence, not folklore. But as we walked back to the cabin, I noticed something else. The forest was silent. The Stellar's jay from the day before was gone. There were no chattering squirrels, no chirping chickadees. The woods were holding their breath. It was a dead, watchful quiet that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I had only ever experienced a silence like that once before, when I was tracking a wounded cougar. It's the silence of a forest that knows a major predator is on the hunt. The rest of the day was tense. I tried to act normal, showing Mark how to properly swing an axe, but my focus was elsewhere. Every snap of a twig in the woods made me jump. I kept scanning the tree line, that dark, impenetrable wall of green and shadow. I felt like I was being watched. Jake was the same. He was quieter than usual, his hand never straying far from the big 45-70 lever-action rifle he kept leaning against the cabin wall. Mark and Sarah were oblivious, caught up in their own world. Mark even made a joke when he saw Jake's rifle. "Expecting trouble, old man?" he'd laughed. Jake didn't answer. As dusk began to settle, the temperature dropped sharply. A cold front was moving in, and the sky was turning a bruised, leaden gray. We built up the fire in the stove and lit the lanterns early, sealing ourselves inside the little fortress of the cabin. The premature darkness felt oppressive, heavier than the night before. The silence outside was absolute. After dinner, no one was in the mood for stories. Sarah was reading a book, Mark was fiddling with his dead phone, and Jake and I were cleaning our rifles. It was a nervous, domestic scene that felt completely surreal. The first sound came around 9 o'clock. It was a scrape. A long, deliberate scraping sound against the back wall of the cabin, the one that faced the dense woods of the ridge. It sounded like thick claws being dragged down the logs. Sarah gasped and looked up from her book, her eyes wide. "What was that?" she whispered. Mark, trying to be the calm boyfriend, shrugged. "Probably just a branch rubbing against the wall in the wind," he said, but there was no wind. The air outside was perfectly still. Then we heard another sound, this one from the front porch. A heavy, wet sniffing. It was loud, powerful, the sound of a massive animal trying to catch a scent, right at the main door. I saw Jake's knuckles turn white as he gripped his rifle. I quietly chambered a round in my own, a Winchester Model 70, chambered in 30-006. The metallic clink of the bolt sliding home was deafening in the silence. "Jake," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There's something on the porch." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the door. The sniffing stopped. For a long minute, there was nothing. We were all frozen, listening. Then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, back and forth. It wasn't an animal pawing at the door. It was being manipulated. Something was standing on our porch, on two legs, and trying to open our door. Sarah let out a small, stifled sob. Mark had gone pale, his bravado completely evaporated. He was staring at the rattling doorknob, his mouth hanging open. The rattling stopped. A new sound started, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very logs of the cabin. It was a sound of pure, predatory malice. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a wolf. It was deeper, more resonant, and it had a strange, almost conversational quality to it. It rose in pitch until it became a drawn-out, mournful howl that was immediately answered by a second, identical howl from the back of the cabin. There were two of them. They were coordinating. They were hunting us. Panic set in. Sarah was crying openly now, and Mark was trying to comfort her, though he was trembling himself. Jake and I moved into action. "Mark, get her into the back bedroom," Jake commanded, his voice steady and authoritative. "Stay away from the windows. Sam, help me with the table." We shoved a heavy pine table against the front door, wedging it under the rattling knob. We did the same with a heavy chest of drawers against the back door. We were barricading ourselves in. As I moved past the main window, the one next to the door, I risked a glance outside. The heavy wooden shutters were closed and barred from the inside, but there was a small gap between two of the slats. I peered through it. For a moment, I saw nothing but the oppressive darkness. Then, something moved at the edge of the lantern light that spilled from the window. A shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of the tree line. It was massive, far bigger than the tracks had suggested. It stood on two long, powerfully built legs that seemed to bend at the wrong angle, like a bird's or a dog's. Its shoulders were immense, a solid wall of muscle and matted fur, and from them hung two impossibly long arms that reached almost to its knees. The arms ended in what looked like large, human-like hands, but they were tipped with claws that caught the light. And the head was the stuff of nightmares. It was long and lupine, like a timber wolf, but scaled up to a monstrous size. It turned its head slightly, and for a heart-stopping second, I saw its eye. It was yellow, and it glowed with a faint, internal luminescence. It wasn't the dumb reflection of an animal's eye. It was intelligent. It was looking right at the cabin. It knew we were in here, and it was waiting. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. "Jake," I choked out, "you're not going to believe this." Before I could describe what I'd seen, the assault began. A tremendous impact slammed into the front door, shaking the entire cabin. It sounded like a battering ram. The table we'd braced against it groaned and scraped a few inches across the floor. "They're trying to break it down," Jake yelled. Another impact, even harder this time. A deep crack appeared in one of the thick wooden planks of the door. Simultaneously, a shattering crash came from the back of the cabin, followed by a scream from Sarah. We rushed to the back room. One of the creatures had smashed the smaller window there. The wooden shutters had held, but the glass behind them was gone, and the frame was splintered. Shards of glass littered the floor. Sarah was huddled in a corner, and Mark was standing in the middle of the room, holding a small handgun he must have brought with him. It looked like a toy. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice cracking. A huge, dark hand with filthy, yellowed claws punched through the damaged shutters, tearing at the wood, trying to get a better grip. The wood splintered and tore like cardboard. Jake raised his .45-70 and fired. The roar of the big rifle in the enclosed space was deafening. The bullet hit the hand dead center, and the creature outside let out a shriek of pain and fury that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a high-pitched, piercing sound that was part wolf, part human scream, and part something else entirely alien. The hand was ripped back through the hole. "Did you get it?" I yelled over the ringing in my ears. I hit it, Jake said, working the lever to chamber another round. But I don't think it's down. He was right. A moment later, a heavy log, easily 10 feet long and as thick as a telephone pole, smashed against the side of the cabin, right next to the broken window. They were using tools. They were trying to punch a hole right through the wall. The impacts came again and again, each one shaking us to the bone. The logs of the cabin were thick and strong, but they wouldn't hold forever. The one at the front had changed tactics. It wasn't trying to batter the door down anymore. Instead, we heard a ripping, tearing sound. It was using its claws to shred the wood around the lock and hinges. Long, deep gouges appeared in the planks, splinters flying into the room. This was a systematic, intelligent attempt to dismantle our only exit. They weren't raging beasts. They were sentient predators, working a problem. We were trapped between two of them, and they were taking our fortress apart piece by piece. Mark was becoming increasingly agitated. "We have to do something," he yelled. "We can't just wait for them to get in." "Stay calm, son," Jake said, his voice a low growl of concentration as he watched the back wall. "Panic is what gets you killed." But Mark wasn't listening. He seemed to have fixated on the front door. He saw the creature's claws working at the wood, and something in him snapped. Maybe he thought he could scare it off. Maybe he just wasn't thinking at all. He raised his small pistol and fired a shot straight through the door. It was a stupid, pointless act of defiance. The tearing sound stopped. For a terrifying second, there was silence. Then, with a roar of absolute fury, the creature outside threw its entire weight against the door. The wood exploded inward. The heavy table we'd used as a barricade was thrown across the room, as if it were made of balsa wood. The door, now hanging by a single hinge, was a wreck of splintered planks. And standing in the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the blackness outside, was the monster. The reality of it was so much worse than the glimpse I'd had through the shutters. It had to be over 8 feet tall, with a lean, wiry build that was deceptively powerful. Its fur was a mangy patchwork of gray and black, matted with dirt and what looked like old, dried blood. Its canine head was lean and skeletal, with lips pulled back in a permanent snarl to reveal long, yellow fangs. But the eyes were the worst part. They glowed with that sickly yellow light, and they were filled with a terrifying, hateful intelligence. It scanned the room, its gaze falling on each of us in turn. It wasn't just an animal looking at prey. It was a killer sizing up its victims. Mark stood frozen, his useless pistol still in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The creature took a step into the room, its strange, backward-jointed legs moving with an unnatural fluidity. It let out a low growl, and I could smell it from across the room, a foul, coppery stench of wet fur, rotting meat, and damp earth. Jake and I opened fire at the same time, the cabin filled with thunder and smoke. I saw my first shot hit it square in the chest, staggering it backward. Jake's shot took it in the shoulder. It roared in pain, but it didn't fall. Any normal animal, even a grizzly, would have been knocked off its feet by 2 high-powered rifle rounds at that range. This thing just shook its head, enraged, and lunged. It didn't go for Jake or me, the ones with the rifles. It went for Mark. It moved with an impossible, terrifying speed. In 2 strides, it crossed the room. Mark didn't even have time to scream. One of its long arms lashed out, and the claws caught him across the chest, ripping through his jacket and shirt as if they were tissue paper. The force of the blow threw him against the wall, and he collapsed to the floor in a heap. Before we could get another shot off, the second creature appeared. It came crashing through the back wall, having finally punched a hole through the logs with its battering ram. It was slightly smaller than the first one, but just as ferocious. It charged straight for Jake. Jake got a shot off, but it was rushed, and the bullet only grazed the creature's side. It slammed into him, and the two of them went down in a tangle of limbs. I heard Jake cry out in pain as the thing's jaws snapped just inches from his face. I turned my rifle on the second creature, but the one that had attacked Mark was now coming for me. I worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round, but it was too fast. It was on me before I could bring the rifle to bear. It swatted the gun from my hands, the impact nearly dislocating my shoulder. The rifle clattered to the floor, and I was left defenseless. I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair, and fell hard. I looked up from the floor into those glowing yellow eyes, and I knew I was about to die. It raised its clawed hand for a final killing blow. Suddenly, there was a deafening blast right next to my head. The creature shrieked and recoiled, clutching at its face. Jake, pinned on the floor by the other monster, had managed to free one arm. He still had his big service revolver, a Smith & Wesson Model 29, in a holster on his belt. He had drawn it and fired, hitting my attacker in the side of the head. The bullet didn't kill it, but it had clearly done serious damage. Blood, thick and black in the lantern light, poured from a wound near its eye. The creature Jake was fighting, distracted by the shot, loosened its grip for a second. That was all the opening Jake needed. He shoved the barrel of the revolver against its ribs and emptied the cylinder. 4 thunderous shots, one after another. The creature convulsed violently, its body bucking and twisting. It let out a gurgling, wet scream and collapsed on top of him. The first one, the one I had been fighting, was still reeling, disoriented by the head wound. It saw its partner fall, and something in its demeanor changed. The aggression was replaced by something else, a flicker of what looked like caution. It looked at its dead companion, then at us. It let out one last frustrated roar that blew the lantern on the table out, plunging half the room into darkness. Then it did something I never would have expected. It reached down, grabbed Mark's motionless body, and slung him over its shoulder as easily as if he were a sack of grain. With its prize secured, it turned and bounded out of the ruined doorway, disappearing into the night. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of our own ragged breathing and Sarah's hysterical sobbing from the back room. The fight had lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The cabin was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, the front door was gone, and there was a gaping hole in the back wall. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, blood, and the foul stench of the creatures. I scrambled to my feet and helped Jake push the dead one off him. It was incredibly heavy. We rolled it over and looked at it in the flickering lantern light. Up close, it was even more grotesque. The fur was coarse and thin in places, revealing a pale, leathery skin underneath. The anatomy was all wrong. The musculature was dense and ropey, like tightly wound cables. The joints were too prominent, the bones too thick. It felt like a crude, biological imitation of a wolf and a man, stitched together by a mad god. "We have to get out of here," Jake said, his voice strained. He was bleeding from a deep gash on his forearm, where one of the creature's claws had caught him. "The other one, it'll be back. It might bring more of them." He was right. We had won the battle, but we hadn't won the war. We were wounded, low on ammunition, and our shelter was compromised. Staying here was suicide. We had to make a run for it. I grabbed my rifle and checked the magazine. 2 rounds left. Jake reloaded his revolver from a speed loader in his pocket. He was out of rifle ammunition. "The truck," I said. "We can make it to the truck." "No good," Jake grunted, tying a strip of torn cloth around his arm. When we were outside this morning, I checked. Tires on both vehicles are slashed. All 8 of them. They did it the first night. They've been planning this, hurting us. A cold dread washed over me. They hadn't just stumbled upon us. They had observed us, isolated us, and then laid a siege. This was a level of intelligence that was deeply, fundamentally terrifying. Our only option was to go on foot. The nearest logging road was at least 5 miles away, through dense, dark forest. It was a death sentence, but it was our only chance. We gathered what we could. I grabbed a flashlight, a compass, and the remaining box of .30-06 cartridges. Jake took a first aid kit and a hunting knife. We had to drag a still sobbing Sarah out of the back room. She was in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. We half-carried, half-dragged her out of the ruined cabin and into the cold, terrifying darkness. The flight through the woods was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves was the sound of the monster returning to finish the job. The flashlight beam cut a weak, bouncing tunnel through the oppressive blackness, revealing a chaotic tangle of undergrowth and looming trees. We stumbled over roots, crashed through thickets, and scrambled down steep, muddy embankments. Sarah whimpered and cried the whole way, and I couldn't blame her. I was terrified. The adrenaline that had sustained me during the fight was gone, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and a primal fear I had never known. We didn't dare use the main track. They would expect that. Instead, I used my compass and my knowledge of the terrain to cut a straight line southwest toward the distant road. It was harder going, but I hoped it would be less predictable. Behind us, we could hear it. A long, mournful howl echoed through the mountains, a sound of loss and rage. It was looking for us. The sound spurred us on, giving us a new surge of desperate energy. We ran, blindly and recklessly, driven by pure terror. I don't know how long we ran. Hours it must have been. My lungs burned, my legs were jelly, and Jake was slowing down, weakened by blood loss. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, I saw a change in the darkness ahead. The trees were thinning. I could see the sky, a faint pre-dawn gray. And then I smelled it, the faint acrid scent of diesel exhaust. We broke through the last line of trees and stumbled onto a wide gravel logging road. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We had made it. We collapsed onto the road, completely spent. As the sun began to rise, casting a weak gray light over the mountains, we heard the rumble of an approaching engine. A logging truck came around a bend, its headlights still on in the dawn gloom. The driver saw us, 3 ragged, bloody figures standing in the middle of his road, and slammed on his brakes. The look on his face was one of pure shock. But we were safe. We were out. The aftermath was just as surreal as the event itself. The logging truck driver took us to the nearest town, which had a small sheriff's office. We told our story. I can still see the look on the deputy's face, a mixture of pity and profound skepticism. He took our statements, but it was clear he didn't believe a word of it. He heard "attacked in a cabin," and his mind filled in the blanks with "bear." Jake and I were veterans of state and federal service. We had credibility. We knew procedure. We described the creatures in meticulous detail. We told them about the tracks, the slashed tires, the intelligent, coordinated attack. We told them about the body of the one we killed, still lying on the floor of the cabin. "Go up there," I pleaded with the sheriff. "The evidence is all there. You'll see." They sent a deputy up later that day. He came back in the evening. His report was concise. He'd found the cabin, he said. It had been ransacked, consistent with a bear attack. There was a lot of blood. The tires on our vehicles were indeed flat, but he noted they were old and could have failed, or it could have been vandalism. He found Mark's handgun on the floor, but the body, the creature we had killed, it was gone. There was no sign of it, he said, just a large, dark stain on the floorboards and a lingering, unpleasant smell. He said he found some large, unidentifiable animal tracks, but they were too smeared by our own panicked footprints to make a clear cast. The official story was written that day. Mark was listed as a missing person, presumed victim of a bear attack. Sarah was in no condition to give a coherent statement. She was heavily sedated and hospitalized for shock. Her fragmented testimony about monsters was dismissed as trauma-induced hysteria. The case was closed. Jake and I were just two old woodsmen who had panicked and misidentified a common predator. We were quietly and professionally dismissed. Before we left town, an older deputy, a man close to retirement, pulled me aside. He had been quiet during the whole debriefing, just watching us with weary eyes. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "I've been working these mountains for 40 years. The official report is what it is. But you boys ain't the first to tell a story like this. Every decade or so, someone goes missing up in that valley. Hikers, hunters, never find a trace. Just whispers and strange stories from folks who are too scared to talk to a man with a badge." He looked me dead in the eye. "My advice to you? Let it go. Forget you ever saw what you saw. And don't ever go back up there. Some things are better left alone. The woods keep their own secrets." It wasn't an admission of belief, not really, but it was a validation of my terror. He knew, or at least he knew enough to not disbelieve. It was the only small comfort in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. That was 4 years ago. I don't work in the woods anymore. I can't. I sold my house near the National Forest and moved to a small town in the flatlands, a place where the horizon is a straight line and the tallest thing for miles is a grain silo. The silence of the forest is no longer a comfort to me. It's a threat. Every shadow holds a memory. Every snap of a twig sounds like a footfall. Jake never fully recovered. The wound on his arm healed, but the one in his mind didn't. He sold the cabin for a pittance to a logging company that eventually tore it down. He moved to Arizona, said he wanted to live somewhere with no trees. We still talk on the phone sometimes, but we never talk about that night. We don't have to. It's always there, an unspoken presence in every conversation. Sarah, I heard, moved back east to live with her parents. I don't know what happened to her after that. I hope she found some peace. I live with the guilt of Mark's death every day. He was arrogant and foolish, but he was just a kid. He didn't deserve what happened to him. I think about his last moments, dragged off into the darkness by that thing. I try not to, but the image is always there when I close my eyes. I failed to protect him. We all did. So that's the story, the truth of it. I don't tell it for sympathy or for attention. I tell it as a warning. The world is not as safe and knowable as you think it is. We live on a well-lit stage, and we believe it's the whole world. But just beyond the lights, in the darkness, there are things ancient and hungry. Things that our modern minds have dismissed as myth and folklore. But they're real. I know they're real. I have the scars and the nightmares to prove it. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and the birds go silent, and you get that feeling on the back of your neck that you're being watched, listen to that feeling. Turn around, go back to the light, because you are being watched, and you are not the apex predator you think you are.